morning, good morning. You know, it used to be we didn't have this much technology we had to carry around with us. We'd walk up here and we had our slides. Y'all know what glass-mounted slides look like? Huh? Y'all ever seen those, had to deal with those? Dr. Gary Smith, when I was starting my career, I'll never forget this. He had a briefcase that weighed 60 pounds that was full of glass-mounted slides. I think there was maybe 2,000 or 3,000 slides in there, and you had to have them glass-mounted. For those of you that don't remember this, you had to have them glass-mounted because when they would sit in these projectors, they'd get too hot and they'd warp. Just a little bit of lesson for y'all in here that don't come from the same age that some of us come from. This is really a treat for me to be here, and I would echo the comments that, you know, you sit around, and particularly for those of you young people in the room, I want to make sure you understand what you're in for today. I have an opportunity to travel around the country and speak to different groups. I see a lot of programs. I see a lot of panels of speakers. I would venture to guess that most of you in the next 10 years will not have an opportunity to be in front of a group of experts as you've got amassed today. Don't miss that. Don't miss that. Don't miss the opportunity on the breaks to ask questions. Pick their brains. I mean, there's a lot of expertise in this room today of people that have traveled, spent their entire lives dedicated to the U.S. livestock and meat industry. So we're tickled that you all are interested in following those footsteps. You know, most of us, when we get to this stage in our careers, we're looking for people that have the same kind of passion and interest that we can help. And don't forget that. Again, there are people that want to help you be successful in your careers. And a lot of them are in this room here today. So take advantage of those relationships. Make sure you introduce yourself to some of the speakers. Let them know what you're interested in focusing in. And we'll look forward to working with you all through your careers here over the next 20 to 30 years. All right, it's time to go to work. I decided, because we're in such a dull market environment, that I'm going to take time today and really try to connect the U.S. role in the global marketplace, but I'm going to give you an economic lesson in the process. How many of y'all, when you get up in the morning, you turn on TV, you got the radio on? Most of you? Okay. What's been going on over the last year? Economic slowdown. China, Japan, now we got North Korea. We got all these things going on. And you sit in here and say, well, that's over there, it doesn't really matter. That's over there, it doesn't matter. I want you to see how it does matter. I want you to see how these things are connected. Today, you're going to have an opportunity to hear a number of the speakers really give you an education on what's going on with how we do business in Japan, how we do business in South Korea, Mexico, China, Canada, whoever it may be. They're going to go into that kind of detail. I'm going to give you a little more macro view of what goes on and why it is important. Whether you're a producer, John, we were just having a conversation. How can a market go from 175 to 117 in 12 months' time? That's a lot of dollars. Calf market went from 280 to 180 in 6 months' time. That's about $500-600 a head, Trevor. Do you see a borrowing basis shrink a little bit over at the bank? It matters, doesn't it? So let's connect some of these things. I want to take a little bit of time and please ask some questions as we go through if you've got any. So this is where we are in the cattle cycle. You go through over time, and I think most of you, if you've heard our presentations, we've been very clear with you that last fall we were making the highs in the cattle cycle. We were making the long-term highs in the cattle cycle in the fall of 2014, early 2015, and this would be the shape of the market. So there's not been any surprise that the market's rolled over and it's trending lower. The only surprise has been is the magnitude of the change, how fast the market is changing. So let's go through that and understand what has happened. Okay, the U.S. is one of the largest protein producers on the planet. The U.S. is the largest beef producer. Typically, they're the first or second largest poultry producer in the world, and about the fifth largest pork producer. Okay? What percentage of all that protein we produce do we consume in the United States? Anybody got a guess? How much? Say it again. 50. Maybe a little higher. 90. 80. Good guesses. Great guesses. We're right in there. About 83% of all the protein we produce in the United States is consumed in the United States. But that still leaves us, just simplify this, 20% of it has to be consumed by consumers somewhere else outside of our borders. Okay? So if you don't have those consumers, or you lose export market share, what's a 20% change in protein supplies on a domestic market do? Drops prices, doesn't it? By about 40%. So this is what we've gone through, and I want you all to see this. This is 2014. Again, we had a perfect storm, a shock. There wasn't enough beef, there wasn't enough pork, there wasn't enough poultry. We went to record prices on everything. 2015, look what happened. Exact opposite. Pork production up 8%, poultry production up 5%, beef production flat. And we end up with record total meat supplies. So what do we do with that? Look at the graph in here, and I want you to focus your eyes on the bars. Those bars are at record high levels. That's total meat production in the United States. We've never produced more protein in the history of the United States as what we did in 2015. 2016 will be bigger again. What's the green line look like that's over the top of it? Is it going up or going down now? That's the exports. That's the export quantity that we've had. So we've gone from exporting 17% of that supply to only exporting 14.5% of that supply. Doesn't seem like that much, does it? Read the text box at the bottom in the gray. Take a second and read that text box. What's it tell you? I've been doing this a few years. 35 years. I've never seen a bigger supply shock in the history of our industry. 4.5 billion more pounds of protein had to be absorbed in our domestic marketplace. 4.5 billion pounds. Because of the net of trade. We had record production, and when you turned on the news, what were you hearing? China's slowing down. Well, how much beef do we export to China? Mark? Legally? We don't even have access, do we? No, we do not. There is a gray market. Obviously, some product can get there in the gray market. We export pork, we export poultry. How many other countries export to that country, to China? 42. What happens when the economy slows down? The other countries that are buying product from the other products from the United States that we're exporting to China, and their market slows down, everybody's economy slows down. They can't reach and buy as much, can they? That's how this is all connected. It's not just China, it's developing countries. What happened with the oil market? When we go from $1 to $1.10 oil, and you've got countries that are oil-producing countries, we call them petro-economies. When they're blowing and going, and then oil goes to $35, how much spending power have you just lost? That's why it matters. When we move into a global marketplace, as we have over the course of the last several years, really over the last decade and a half is really when we've got into a global marketplace. This will be something that each and every one of you will have to spend a higher percentage of your time understanding, researching, following on a daily and weekly basis if you're going to be successful in these markets. And guess what? These markets are kind of important. They're kind of important. That's where our commerce is. That's where money moves. They're very important. So as we go through the conversation today, I want to make sure we hit on some of these things you need to be aware of. This is the currencies. This is the change in purchasing power. You hear about the strength in the dollar. Well, what's it really mean? What's it really mean? Look at the right-hand side of that graph and just look at the tables here. Let's just go down here to the yen. Japan is one of the biggest importers of U.S. beef products. Pork, poultry, whatever it may be. The value of the yen compared to the dollar, their purchasing power is down 16%. You can see what's going on. You can see where this starts from July of 14 through Christmas. Their purchasing power is down that much. You go down here, look at the Canadian dollar, down 23%. They've lost that much purchasing power. That's why the dollar is so important. That's just like, hey, you've got $1 million here. You got $1 million in here and the currency changed this much. The effective impact of that is you just lost 15% of your purchasing power by the change in currencies. And the currency battle is going to be the biggest thing we deal with over the next 12 to 18 months. Because when economies slow down, this is one of the only ways that you can try to stimulate exports, stimulate businesses, manipulating currency. Okay? Connect the dots. All right. This is what's happened in these commodity indexes over time. Are they going up and to the right or down and to the right? Pretty clear, isn't it? Pretty clear. This is all commodities. When you roll these commodity indexes in, you can see the changes. You can see the devastation that we've had. Most of these are off 30, 40, 50% over the course of the last 12 to 18 months. This is not something that has just been beef or pork or poultry specific. All commodities have gone through this same devaluation over the course of the last 12 to some of them 36 months. And I don't see anything that tells me that we're necessarily done going down other than we've gone down this much now. Most of them are down 40 to 60%. I'll get you updated on that here in just a few minutes. How about right now? Look at the change. This is as of January 1 or 12/17. This is a change, so it took into account the lows in the market. This is coming off the absolute highs that we made in each of these commodities in the last few years. So Trevor, when you look at this, you say, you go over here to lean hog prices. Their lows, as you come through here, their absolute highs occurred in July of 2014. Since July of 2014, lean hog prices are off 58%. That's how you read that chart. Wow. Wow. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a producer. If you've had lean hog prices in 18 months are off 60%. How many of y'all could have survived a 60% change in the value of that product without being hedged? There's not very many people stout enough that they could get through that without having a chunk of that product hedged. Okay? And again, look at the changes in here. Several of you in the room come from a family farming background. Corn and bean prices off 50 and 60%. Big changes. Again, these markets are very fast in reacting. They change to these dynamics in a hurry. The cattle market, when you look at this, again, from the fall of 2014, fed cattle prices are down 30%, feeder cattle prices are down 40%. Jim, I don't need to tell you, milk prices are down 41%. All of these have come through. We've gone through this. It's been across the board, and it's all connected. Again, what's the U.S. role in the global marketplace? How does this stuff work? How does it work? Learn your lesson. Learn the lesson. Study it. Understand currency changes, the impact that that has. And you'll be positioned that, I'm not saying you're going to be able to catch every one of these moves, but you'll be positioned to where you can operate with your headlights as opposed to your tail lights. And that's a big advantage. Okay? Any questions on that? Yes, sir.
Well, when you speak of headlights and hedging, you look back from the rest of 2015, the CME provided no live cattle hedge.
You say what?
The CME did not provide any live cattle hedging. The market provided discounts.
The point is with the market situation, with the futures markets we've had, it's been more difficult in here to be effective with our risk management programs. Discounts are there for a reason, aren't they? The discounts were telling you the market had rolled over. So that's not a surprise. When a market makes a top, the futures markets are going to understand that. They're going to be discounting in, pricing in that supply increase that I showed you. Selling the discount was still the right thing to do, wasn't it? It was still the right thing to do. You lost less. The problem is we bought cattle too high. That was the problem. From a procurement standpoint, we paid too much for everything in the inventory. We were at levels that were not sustainable. When the global economy started to soften, we were at levels that we could not sustain. And it's really that plain and simple. So it's a trade-off. I would argue, and we'll talk about it a little more with the volatility we've had with our market tools, the volatility has made it more difficult than I would say the absolute price levels. You have a point there, Casey?
Well, that's what I'm saying. That it moves the pace of change. There, and again, the volatility has been so rapid that it's hard to get a handle on what you should do.
So let me just give you a little backdrop of the volatility we've had. This started on about August 20th. On August 20th, the week of between the 10th and it was either the 10th or the week of the 15th, Tyson announced that they were closing the Denison packing plant. We had front-end supplies. We had the China stock market, as you remember. We had days that the U.S. stock market in August was off 1,000 points. Y'all remember that? So we had all of this stuff going on. That was the start of the increased volatility. Our markets have been changing. On average, we've been changing about $15 to $18. I've got a chart on this, $15 to $18 every 15 days. That's how much the futures are moving, Bill. So we just came out of one. We just came out of an $18 rally in 13 days. And now the market's pulling back again, isn't it? So we've had this going on since August. Boom, $15, $18, 15 days, then we correct, then we do it again. That's a market that doesn't know. When you're in this kind of global chaos, market doesn't know. And that's part of the reason we're seeing the kind of extreme volatility that we're seeing in here. Again, we don't know what's going to happen in the global marketplace. There's a lot of uncertainty. And we're exporting, historically we've exported 16 billion pounds of protein out of our domestic market into these global countries. 16 billion pounds. Now, we're not going to do that this year. It's going to be about 14 billion pounds because of the slowdown. All right. This is what we typically look like from a beef, pork, and poultry export standpoint. You can see in here, if you look at the data, you can see where we peaked in here basically at that 16 billion pound area. This is where it's been. Look where it is here in 15. Again, basically right back in here to 14. That's a big change, isn't it? Again, it's just showing you how much more protein you've got to absorb on your domestic marketplace than what we've had historically. Year to date, look at the changes here. Beef, poultry, off significantly. Pork about flat. Think about this though. Pork production's up 8%. Pork exports are flat. We normally export what, Paul? Nearly 25% of all of our pork? That math doesn't work, does it? If production's up 8% and exports are flat, that's not good arithmetic. And that's what we've really gotten into. So you look at these numbers in here, we'll get in and we'll talk about broilers in a little more detail in here with the impact of things like high-path AI. Because obviously that's had a big impact on exports and what's happened within that part of the world as far as having access to some of these countries. When we think about beef exports, and we look at it just on by itself in here, again, we're down 300 million pounds on beef exports. Just put it simply, we're down about that much. When you look at the value, we're down about $725 million from a value standpoint, just in 1 year. It matters, doesn't it? We only export about, Paul, would you use 11% of our beef? Or would you use 13% with beef and beef byproducts? 13% if we include the beef and beef byproducts. 10 to 11% if we look at our just beef alone. So again, depending on the number you're using, you're referencing in here, that's a big change, isn't it? And we. Y'all hear that? Would you say that again, Paul?
That $750 million there equates to what we export in terms of just variety meats. And we don't consume variety meats in this country.
I want to make sure that everybody gets this point. Paul, explain what the variety meats are. Go ahead.
They're primarily just the blood and guts is what it boils down to. It's livers, hearts, kidneys. With beef, we get a few other items such as the tendons and things like that. And, we have to export them because we're not going to consume them here in the United States.
So if we can't export them, they're basically going to rendering, aren't they, Paul?
Well, pet food more
Pet
than
food.
anything. And that's a good market, but you're looking at, and Mark probably could get a better number, but it's probably around 20 cents a pound. And, even livers going into Egypt, those could be up as high as 80 cents a pound. So we're taking a 60-cent drop in just that one item. So it's a pretty significant hit if we can't get those items out of the country.
What percentage of our hide and variety meat production would be exported historically?
100.
Y'all hear that? So when you have a hide and offal value that's worth $13, today it's only worth $10.50. But if it's worth $13 and you got a 1,400 pound animal, do the math on that. The total dollars per head from the value of that hide and those variety meats and the offal items, the blood, the whole 9 yards. Think about that. That's why trade is important. That's why we're here. Why do we work so hard in Washington, D.C.? You're going to hear Chandler and some of the other group talk to have a level playing field to where we can have access to consumers in other parts of the world. What percent of the world's population lives in the United States? 4 or 5%. Everybody get it? Big stuff. Big stuff. And it'll become more and more important to us as we move down the road, as the population continues to increase. The Western Hemisphere is the largest meat-producing area on the planet. When you look at the United States, Brazil, you go all the way down through South America, that's where the protein is produced. Yes, China is the largest pork producer by far. But when you get outside of that, the real meat producers are in these other regions. And I think as we go through this data and you think that through, this will all start to make sense to you. The import side. I get a lot of questions on imports. People spend a lot of time worrying about imports. Imports are a direct reflection of what kind of lean beef supplies we have available domestically. When we go through a major expansion as we have over the last 3 years in the U.S. cattle industry, what are we doing with our female stock? Are we keeping our cows longer in our production streams? Absolutely, aren't we? If they're producing a profitable calf, we're keeping them longer. That means we're harvesting fewer of those cows, and therefore we're producing less lean beef. Well, what percentage of our beef consumption, Dr. Smith, is in the form of ground beef in the United States? Over half. Let's just use half. Let's just use 50% as the number. So if we don't have lean beef production coming from our cows, from our bulls, even from our fed steers and heifers that are coming through our systems, we have to import more. And it's just a direct relationship. If our cow slaughter picks up, as it will this next year, I'm pretty certain lean beef imports are going to be down about 10% because cow slaughter is going to increase. It's that tight of a relationship. And again, it's because we have that kind of demand for lean beef. When I was driving in last night, I couldn't believe it. How many Smash Burgers and Five Guys Burgers joints I see driving in from Harmony Road and down College Avenue last night. Again, it's totally changed the landscape, hasn't it? You guys like your burgers. We like our burgers too. So that's part of it. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And again, we can either blend the imported product with our domestic supply, or we can give that market to pork and poultry. We already have given a lot of it to turkey burgers and that kind of thing, haven't we? So this is what it looks like year to date. Again, I want you to think about this. This is U.S. total meat exports year to date. You see these numbers over here? They're down 1.4 billion pounds. That's a big change. This is on a carcass weight basis, but think about it this way. Take 1.4 billion, we've got, let's just simplify this, divide it by 300 million people in the United States. Is everybody getting the point? That doesn't take into account the increase in production. That's just the drop in exports on how much more domestic meat supply we've had in the U.S. From a value standpoint, we're off $2.7 billion. Now does it start to make sense why pork prices are off 58%, poultry prices are off 50%, feeder cattle prices are off 41%, fed cattle prices are off 31%. All of this stuff is connected. When you look at it from a per head basis, just the value on a per head basis, we're $70 a head just on the meat value alone below where we were a year ago from an export standpoint. Let's keep moving in here. This will give you a pretty good perspective of how supply and demand work. This gives you a sensing in here of the supply shock that we've gone through in 1 year's time. When it's all said and done, we will end up consuming 10 to 11 more pounds. Everybody find the red bar. Find the first red bar and compare it to the blue bar to the left of it. This is how much protein we consume in the United States. The last several years we've been consuming 200 pounds of protein per person. Isn't that interesting? Did y'all realize you consume that much? Probably most of us in this room are up around 250 or 60 pounds. We probably are. Because most of us eat meat several times a day. At least we still do in our household. 200 pounds to 210 to 211 pounds. Now I ask you, if you're going to consume an additional 10 to 11 pounds, John, the market's going to force another 10 to 11 pounds on you or make it available. Are you going to spend as much money for that extra 10 to 11 pounds? Are you? No. It's kind of simple, isn't it? When you really boil it down into those kind of terms, it's pretty simple, isn't it? Again, you hear the terminology that the market has to ration a smaller supply. It has to ration a smaller supply with much higher prices. And that's why we went through the situation that fed cattle prices went from $1.20 to $1.70 because we had to ration substantially smaller supplies. There wasn't enough to go around. Prices had to get strong enough where people couldn't afford to buy it, as crazy as that sounds. But that's what had to happen because there just wasn't enough supply. And that happened across pork, and it happened across poultry. So that, again, that's why it was such a perfect storm. Yes?
How much of that 10 to 11 extra pounds is going to be beef though? We only dropped 30%, the pork fat dropped 58%.
We'll get the mic on here. Go ahead.
How much of that 10 to 11 extra pounds is going to be beef consumption just because our prices dropped 30% and pork dropped 58%, and I mean, they're already a cheaper protein source. Wouldn't you go for the cheaper?
I tell you what, she gets a prize right there, okay? Kevin, she's awake this morning. That's a great question. It's a great question. Again, all these proteins are connected, aren't they? They're all connected. Beef production is down in the United States. Our imports are up. So our per capita consumption of beef is basically flat from where it was a year ago. All of this increases it from pork and poultry. All of it is from pork and poultry. It's a great question. Very, very good insight there. Way to connect the dots. Yes, sir.
When was the last time Australia triggered their tariff rate quota?
The question is, when was the last time Australia triggered their tariff rate quota? Paul, do you know the answer to that? I would say it's been a while because they don't want to trigger it. Just like you could see back in August with the way the import numbers were running. You could see in August that imports from Australia would have to decline substantially by the time we got to the end of the year, or they would in fact trigger that. Well, they don't want to trigger it. They don't want to trigger that. So that's why when you go back and you look at this chart, you've seen this slowdown in here. Right there. You see this change here? You can forecast what that was going to be. We started forecasting in August. Imports at that time were up 42%. We forecast by the end of the year they would be up between 18 and 19. We overshot it just a little bit. But we were doing it just basically knowing where the quota was, where they would trigger it. So that's how that thing has come back in line. You can see where we'll end up with it being somewhere in this 16 to 18 or 19% increase year over year. Good question. Man, you guys are doing good this morning. Is this making sense? All right. Let's shift gears. Let's look at a few of these other things so you can see what's going on. Because, again, with the last question that was asked up here, how much of it was beef, how much was pork, how much of it was poultry? All of the increase in the U.S. marketplace is other meats. But all those other meats are substantially cheaper than beef, aren't they? When the economy slows down, you start displacing, don't you? Again, when beef is 3 times the price of pork, people are going to shift, and they're going to buy more pork and less beef. That's the trade-off that we've had in here on our domestic marketplace. We've been seeing that shift take place between beef and pork and beef and poultry. So when we look at these numbers in here, the slowdown that we've had, look at the line on poultry, broilers. Y'all see that big decline that we've got there? Let's see if I can find the pointer there. Just look at where they peaked and how they came off in here in the last year. High path AI. High path AI. Avian influenza. What happened with that? Remember, of all the pork we produce, 20% of it is exported. 20%. When we started seeing our breakouts of high path AI in the spring of last year, we lost access to about 20% of our exporting countries very quickly. They closed their doors and said, we don't want it. We don't want your poultry product, because they were concerned that they would contaminate their operations over there. Obviously, there isn't a lot of science behind that, but that doesn't matter. We lost access to those markets, and we still don't have most of them back. I think today would be at 16, 17% of those that we still don't have access to today. So all that product's coming back onto the domestic marketplace at cheap prices, isn't it? Okay? Again, that's what we have to be aware of as we work through here. We see these markets. You can see on the blue line down here is beef. Look how flat it's been. We've got the highest prices in the world with what we've had. We're not higher than some of the specialty products that you see out of Japan, but we're going to look at major suppliers relative to U.S., Australia. You think about the change in currencies, the strength of the dollar. Obviously, you're not going to be exporting a lot more product when we're going through a big accelerated expansion, because our production numbers are not increasing. So that's the way that would trade off for us. So the global demographics, again, the key thing I want you to see here is the population. Only 4 to 5% of the world's population is in the U.S. And we look at the way the population is going to grow over the course of the next several decades, this becomes a big deal. We have to make a decision as a U.S. beef industry on how we're going to play in that global market. There's some countries out here that don't have the same philosophy that we do on growth promotants. Okay, let's just get right down to it. There's been trade barriers for a long time. Are we going to have to continue to change our production protocols to be able to have access to more of these consumers around the world? Those are issues that our industry is going to have to deal with. And the panels here coming over the course of the next several hours in front of you, I think will deal with some of those issues head on. The population increases that we're going to go through. Again, you just look at the slope of that and the way this thing is moving. By 2050, we're expecting to have about 9 billion people. That's a big change from where we are today. Who's going to feed all these people? Look at the difference in the population in here versus the developing countries versus the developed countries. Internalize what that's telling you. The developed countries, we're seeing population flatten out, aren't we? In the developing countries, look at the slope of that. How much purchasing power are they going to have? Again, we've got to make sure that we think that through. Paul, is there something in here when we look at production in the United States? It'd be nice if we could figure out how fast these global markets were going to be able to grow to where we could do a better job of ratcheting the kind of levels and at least having that discussion as industries, how much pork production we can stand, how much poultry production we can stand, how much beef production we can stand. Any ideas on that?
If I had an answer, I might be famous, but no, but that's the equation we're going to try and figure out is understanding how they grow. One example, though, would be if you look at China, and you just alluded to it, Randy, is the growing middle class there. The thing we got to understand with that country is that they have had a one-child or one-birth rule for a number of years. Now, they just stopped that this year. What that says is the grandparents of that child and the parents of that child will push that money or their inheritance down to that single child. So we got a whole lot of kids that are out there, and they're adults now, that are going to have a lot of wealth. So if you can measure those kind of demographics in a country, you might be able to figure out what the consumption is going to be. The best thing we have, though, is the ability to see what their economies are. And we just know from history, as economies become richer, which are these developing countries he has up there, they are going to have the wherewithal to purchase better food. And obviously, animal proteins are better foods. So they're going to migrate from what we call a grain diet to an animal protein diet. And so I don't know if we can measure that very well, but that's the part of the equation we have to try and figure out.
Thank you. Again, I think through the course of the day, these are some of the issues that we need to talk about. We've got a free market system. If I'm sitting in here and I can make $500 a head with $2 calves, John, I'm going to continue to produce as many of them as I can. If you're sitting out here and your cost of production is $2.20, this market's going to slow down your appetite for expansion, isn't it? So the market will take care of that to some degree as we move up and down. That's the way it should work. It's be very difficult to go out here and just say, hey, we can't stand more than 2%, because we really don't know. Again, it's part about market share as we look at this not only in the U.S. but globally as we move down the road. So look at the increase in here. And the one thing I want you to see on this chart is we focus all of our conversation on beef, pork, and poultry. I wanted you to see the line on aquaculture. That's a tough one to get our arms around. That's a tough one. The data's not great. Again, you get a lot of confusion when you pull data in this whole aquaculture area. We've got a lot of farm-raised salmon. We've got all of this stuff that's going on within shrimp and the farm-raised shrimp, you know, the word it's not freshwater shrimp, that type of thing. But it's something I want to make sure that you're keeping on your radar screen. We're talking about 14, 15 pounds of consumption when we look at that in the U.S. marketplace alone. So it's a big number. It's a big number, and it's a growing number as far as how much of that we're consuming. Yes, sir.
Would that be included in your overall meat consumption numbers?
It is not included in the meat consumption number. It's just beef, pork, poultry, and turkey that is included in the meat consumption number. So that seafood and fish number is not included in it. Good question. This gives you a pretty good feel of the growth that we've seen here over the course of the last several years. You look at, this is global meat and broiler production. Look how flat beef has been. Again, think about it. The U.S. is the largest beef producer, and we've been declining the last several years as we've gone through this expansion. First, we went through all the drought and the downsizing of the herd. Then we've gone through the expansion. Pork has been growing at the rate of 4 billion pounds a year, and poultry nearly 5 billion pounds a year. So for those of you that are in the beef industry in here in the room, I want to make sure you get this message. The beef industry will continue to get a smaller share of a growing market. We are not going to keep the same market share as we go down the road. It will be a smaller share of a growing market. I think that's the key thing that you need to understand. There's plenty of opportunity for growth for the beef industry, but it's not going to be, we're not going to have the same market share when we look down the road, because these others can do it. They're cheaper proteins, and when we come in and you look at the developing countries, again, what was Paul's point? They're moving from a rice and beans diet in these undeveloped countries, and they're starting to put meat protein in the diet. It doesn't really matter to them. It's got to be a cheap protein to get into those diets initially, and then as their incomes grow, so does our opportunity to sell them more high-quality beef protein. A good perspective for you here. Again, if I ask audiences around the country who is the largest beef producer, I nearly always get Brazil. I nearly always get Brazil as the largest producer. The U.S. is still the largest producer. And with the expansion that we've gone through here over the course of the last several years, or the last few years, I suspect that we're going to continue to be the largest producer. We'll be harvesting another 750,000 head of cattle a year, just fed cattle a year, over each of the next 3 to 4 years as a result of the expansion we've gone through. So again, we're going to maintain that. You can see the U.S. relative to the Brazil, the top two lines. You can see the gap has been narrowing in here. Look at the far right-hand side, the top two lines on that. That's the U.S. and Brazil. The gap's been narrowing. Brazil is still growing, but now the U.S. is growing as well. And again, they're pretty close together, and they're going to stay pretty close together in here. But again, we're finally starting to see some growth in the U.S. marketplace. I think it's important for you to understand that 85% of the world of the production is in those top 11 countries. 85%. That's pretty heavy concentration when you think about that. And 67, just simplify it, 70% in the top 6 countries. Where are those top 6 countries? To my point earlier. The export standpoint, Brazil is obviously the largest exporter, Brazil and India. Anybody have any particular expertise on the Indian market? Paul? Chandler? Buffalo? Let's talk about it. I want to make sure you all understand what we're dealing with here.
It's typically buffalo meat. As you know, beef or cattle are sacred in India, although we're hearing that the Muslims in that country do, let's say, acquire the beef, and they are slaughtering them. But the big market he's showing up there now is buffalo. It's called Cara beef. Extremely low quality. It's a byproduct of their dairy industry. They do milk these buffalo. Once the cow has expired or spent her time as a milking, when they go into the meat market, it's very low quality, mostly used for manufacturing meats in other countries. If a bull calf is born, he'll probably die. They have no desire to keep the bull. They'll keep a handful around just for genetic reasons, but those baby calves will just die on the place. So it's, but apparently, I didn't know this, Randy, from your previous chart, it's growing. So they're just retaining more and more of these buffalo to, I guess, to grow their dairy market.
Y'all see that here? Find the purple line here. Chandler, anything you'd add to that?
I had the chance a couple years ago to meet the largest slaughterer of cattle in India, and he was over here with his senior team on a Cochrane scholarship, which is a scholarship program to bring agricultural leaders from around the world to the United States. People may know about it in this room. And they were here studying the U.S. beef industry and how it operated. They were interested in feeding cattle. They were interested in increasing their productivity of their slaughter operations. Pretty serious fellows, and they're all Muslim, of course. There's some tension right now in India about killing these animals. The Brahmin cattle are the ones that are sacred, but they're getting stole off the street. And you know, but you could just see the glint in their eye. I mean, they see the protein, the money that's there. And they're right next door to Southeast Asia, so that's where they're going to be.
Again, it wasn't on our radar screen 7, 8 years ago. But when you talk about a market that moves the way this one has moved, with the value and the dollars that could be created there, obviously it's been one that has seen significant growth. And yet, that product, what they produce, even though it falls into the beef category, I don't think that product competes with the U.S. beef market at all. At all. Because it's such a low quality protein compared to what we're providing on that global marketplace. Thank you. Okay. Here we are when we look at these numbers, and I want you to think about this. I want you to think about the ramifications of a country like the U.S. that's exporting 12-13% of our total production. Yes, we're a major player, the biggest beef producer in the world, as compared to a country like New Zealand, Australia, Uruguay that are exporting, they're smaller producers, but they're exporting 70 to 75% of their total production. What's the difference that they have as a mindset from a producer standpoint and from a government standpoint? Again, all the value is being generated in those markets from accessing the global trade, isn't it? They put laws in place. They do all the things necessary to make sure that they can be competitive in the global marketplace. And we do stupid stuff like M-Cool here. Again, it's a total difference in here from a mindset of what we have to deal with. Because we've been the 800-pound gorilla in the U.S. from a production standpoint for decades. We really set the world's market price in here, and of course the currencies moving up and down would move that. But when we're talking about having access to consumers today, the Australians, the Uruguayans, the New Zealanders, they will do whatever they have to do to have access and make sure that that product flow is consistent. And yet we don't have a policy structure that has been really built that way, have we? We work hard at it, but again, when we go through things like M-Cool, y'all are familiar with M-Cool, the situation that was going on there. I want you to think about this to put it in perspective. We had unfair trade practices with two of our biggest markets, Canada and Mexico. 30% or 32% of all of our beef exports went to Canada and Mexico. 40 to 42% of all of our pork exports went to Canada and Mexico. And we're sitting here having these kind of trade practices in place? Silly. If we wouldn't have repealed M-Cool, in our estimation, it would have cost the U.S. beef industry another $12 a hundred. Just the beef portion of it, not even to take into account what would happen on the pork side. Another $12 a hundred. Silliness, silliness. Again, that was part of the volatility that we experienced in here in the month of December. We got to go up to the last minute to get this thing repealed. The market had to discount that in, didn't it? The market had to discount in the risk that we didn't get it repealed. We went down $10 to $12 in 2 weeks' time, going right into the deadline on the repeal. Tell me that's coincidence. That's a market being pretty efficient at what it has to do. Don't get me started. It was closed there. Okay. Imports, trade. This is what I was talking about earlier. Those import numbers are going to decline as we move forward. They're going to decline because we're going to have more cow slaughter within our system. More cow slaughter, more fed slaughter. We won't need to bring in as much lean beef as what we have in the past. When we look at from a production standpoint, again, look at the yellow bar on China. Take that out of there and put this chart into perspective. Put it in perspective. Let's start with poultry. Who is the largest poultry producer? Who's got the two biggest blue bars out there? It's U.S. and Brazil, isn't it? Let's go to beef. Go to the red bar. Who's got the two biggest beef bars? U.S. and Brazil. And when we go down here and we find the pork portion of it, obviously China is, what, 56% of the world's pork production? Plus or minus 10%, who knows, based on the data we get out of China. They've got 56%, then you go to the EU, and then the U.S. The U.S. is typically in there in that third or fourth slot as far as pork production. So we are a major player here. We're a major player in here. When you look at these numbers and you see what's going on, obviously China dominates the hog world, and they will continue to dominate it. But they're still one of the largest importers of pork, even though they have that. They're still one of the largest importers of pork. And again, why have we seen the transition? What's Smithfield? It's no longer Smithfield, is it? Owned by a Chinese company. Will we see more of that kind of investment as we move down the road? I think we will. I think we will see more of that kind of investment. I think that's a conversation we need to have here today to where everybody understands why that's happening. These are our production forecasts for pork this next year. We think pork production is going to flatten out after an 8% increase this year. We think it'll flatten out. The biggest thing on here is the export side. We expect we'll see a 5 to 6% increase in pork exports in 2016. So we'll start to see a little bit of stability. Probably the most important thing for each of you to see in here, if you're really looking at it from a market standpoint, is per capita pork supplies will obviously be down just a little bit. So a balance in trade. Record production, we had it in 15. We're going to have even bigger production in 16. So it's important that we do see the trade balance come back in place. From a global production standpoint, poultry is again, I just showed you the chart a few minutes ago where we're growing nearly 5 billion pounds annually from a global standpoint. That's not going to change anytime soon. And again, you can see the U.S. in here from a global production standpoint. You can see where we are. You can see where Brazil is. We're going to continue to be major players in the poultry marketplace. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But when you're exporting 20% of that total poultry supply, we've got to make sure that we're able to move it. And when you have things like high-path AI, it can have huge ripple effects in this market. So again, you've got to make sure you're connecting the dot in here. If we want to grow our global presence, the trade-off is you're likely going to create a little more volatility in the market because of uncertainty. When you have animal health, disease issues, whatever that may impact our ability to be able to move products. Hey, we still haven't got China open after BSE, have we? So we've got those kind of issues out here. Those are the things that we need to be aware of as we move down the road. There's our global poultry production. I think you all get that drift. There's the migration flow. I put this in here just to give you all a little bit of insight on some of the complexities we got into with high-path AI. Because it has been such a big deal, and I don't think people have done a very good job of understanding the ramifications that it's had on our U.S. marketplace with the amount of protein that we've had to absorb. And the price spreads. We've had record-wide beef poultry spreads really most of the last 9-10 months. We've never seen them wider. Again, we've got too much of this supply in our marketplace. How many of y'all sit down and eat leg quarters every day? You want to talk to us about the leg quarter market, Mark?
Well, the leg quarter market's big, 9 cents.
Can you talk to these guys? Will you turn around so they can hear you?
Well,
Get down here.
Y'all know what a leg quarter is?
back end of the chicken. And we're really a breast meat market in the United States, and we traditionally export the back end of the chicken, which is leg quarters. And today's market on leg quarters is about 9 cents a pound. And one of the things we like to do is go into the supermarket and pick up a package of beef at $7, $8, $9 a pound, and do the math on how many leg quarters you can buy for that package of beef, and that's what a lot of our consumers are doing today. And the other thing is, at 9 cents, it's a valuable protein on the world market where we don't have access, and we really can't render it. We don't have the rendering capacity to put it into rendering value. So it's a dynamic out there. If we don't have the export market to take a lot of this dark meat off of the market, it's going to continue to flow on to the domestic market at a very cheap price. Wings are out of the sky, Super Bowl's coming.
We got the Super Bowl rally in wings, don't we? We always get one.
Randy, could you go back to that slide that you showed, the U.S. and Brazil? Sorry.
No worries. This one?
One more. Yeah.
There?
So what I wanted to ask you about real quickly, so the poultry industry is much more vertically integrated than beef or maybe even sometimes pork. And so if you take that blue line and you take that red line and you consider the poultry industry being vertically integrated all the way back to genetics, and then you think about the fact that one or two companies are responsible for both the blue line and the red line, then that number gets more interesting.
Great perspective. Good perspective.
That's like one or two or three companies controlling the sum of those two lines, right?
Y'all see that? So what's the bottom line of that?
I'm not sure. I was going to ask you that. I think there's a lot of market power in poultry right now.
There always has been. When we look at the large size of the integrators, we've always had a lot of market power there, a lot of concentration.
Yeah, you mentioned poultry access, or at least Mark did. Most of us are familiar with beef access problems. What's the problem with poultry access around the globe?
The biggest question relative to poultry access has been high path AI. It's been disease issues. So we need to get through this first half of this year without any more breakouts, any more issues. If we can do that, then I think we'll start to see some of these countries that have closed the U.S. Reopen to us. Paul, last question.
Yeah, Randy, back to your chart on imports declining, I think 11%, and our production going up 4%. That implied the ground beef market's going to stay fairly flat.
That's right.
Are we seeing the QSR move to more poultry and pork rather than hamburger?
I'm not sure that we can say that yet, Paul, on that quick serve side that we can actually measure that. I think anecdotally we can see that more in some of our restaurant or in our retail data. We've seen a pickup there, but it's still small. It's still small when we look at that ground poultry item where it would be displacing ground beef or a product like that, but it's obviously growing.
It seems almost like ground beef overwhelms, particularly just overwhelms it right now, and even a small decrease, we just don't see it.
There's a lot of expertise in this room. Can anybody answer the question specifically? Can you answer Paul's question on, are we seeing quick serve restaurants, are we seeing poultry add market share? That's
Maybe even pork.
pork. Can we measure that? Can anybody answer that question? they keep the ground beef machine working, but if we look at the transition over time on the quick serve, the menu became a lot more poultry oriented over the course of the last decade as beef supplies tightened up and prices got higher. But I don't know that in the last 12 to 18 months in this phenomenon, if we can actually measure some of the differences Paul's asking about.
I think it's more in the family style. I think that's where you see the biggest shift away from beef. It's not in the quick serve because they kind of got their menus pretty well set. If you look at the Applebee's, you look at the family style restaurants, you see a big movement, where there's only one or two beef items on the menu anymore, and you got much more poultry on there, and you got more pork items. So I'd say it's in that mid-range. The beef industry still enjoys the top-end steakhouse market, and still the quick serve, but that family style is really good.
Thank you all for for sharing your insights through the discussion here this morning. We'll look forward to more of that in here through the course of the day. Appreciate being with you.